All right, thank you, Jason. It's great to see everybody here today, and I am thrilled that we get to have the conversation that we are about cybersecurity in the age of AI. And with us, we've got, well, there's really no one better than Mitch Herckis. Mitch, coming up here. Mitch is the head of government affairs at Wiz. Now, if you've heard of Wiz, it might be because they were in the news recently, just acquired by Google for $32 billion, the largest Google acquisition ever, and one of the largest cybersecurity acquisitions. But Mitch and I actually first met a number of years ago. We got a chance to work together in New York City government. Mitch was in the leadership of New York City Cyber Command, which really led the way nationwide on how to do cybersecurity at the local level. I was at the time the CTO of the city. And after that, he continued to serve. He went to the federal level, and in the Biden administration was in the Office of Management and Budget, working with the federal CIO, and then joined Wiz to head up government affairs. So to start, Mitch, if we could, I'd like to kick it off because you've done so many things in the last handful of years, and you've seen so much change in the last handful of years, from the public sector, from the private sector. Can you talk to folks about what is different now about cybersecurity today than just a few years ago?
Sure. Well, I think one of it is the central nature of the cloud to everything we do, I think is where I'd start. And that started during the pandemic. It really is supercharged during the pandemic, particularly for cities. Because cities, states, and the federal government, frankly, all had to make decisions very quick about how to deliver services in a quick way, in novel ways, and find ways to spin them up rapidly. And having worked for New York City during that time, I know there was a lot of conversations that we need to start this service tomorrow because lives are at risk. And you all in New York City Cyber Command have to tell us it's safe or figure out how to make it safe urgently. That's not an easy thing in government. It's not something we are used to doing. We're used to being very intentional, taking our time, making sure everything is correct. But when we have to move at speed, we can do it. One of the things with cloud that's unique and different is it just adds speed and complexity in a way that is traditional systems do not. When you have a server in the corner, you have to make changes to it. In the cloud, you can get extra space, extra add-ins, right? You can add APIs to connect to outside systems. You have non-human identities reaching in. And then people can spin up new systems that you may or may not have known were there. So trying to get your arms around that and your teams around that new environment is a complexity that large organizations, whether they be public or private sector, were struggling with for some time. Wiz, being 5 years old, saw an opportunity there where they saw that the tools that were on-premise didn't really extend to the cloud environment in the way that was natural, and thought there was a new way outside the structures we had built to look at the cloud, and created a way without placing agents everywhere, which was a pain I knew in New York and also in the federal government across large, complex organizations. Is time-consuming to get that agentless visibility into everything in your cloud, and then understand those risk and attack patterns, which are always changing as new threats come on board. So I think it takes away some of the fear of cloud that we've had for some time, particularly in the public sector, just because of the need to scale and also meet all our compliance and regulatory needs, and frankly, the security threats as well. So more to answer your question, really, people have moved rapidly to the cloud over the last 5 years. And with that complexity, and then AI on top of that is just kind of fuel onto the fire, and we can talk about that. But really, how do we manage that, and how do we get our hands around it in a way, recognizing we can't just hire our way tons more people to do it?
I remember when we worked together in New York City, one of the things that just struck me was that New York City faced billions of events daily, billions. And so there's no way to staff your way out of that. There's no way to hire enough people. You've got to have modern tools. But what do you think is a misperception when people are thinking about cybersecurity in the age of AI? What are they getting wrong today?
I would say one of the things that people might a lot of cities and states, and even recently the federal government, were talking about how are we going to adopt AI. And I think one of the realities people have to notice is it's already here. It's probably integrated into a lot of the software and platforms you use. You know, we have visibility into a lot of different environments. Over 85% of the environments that we defend, which is half of the Fortune 100, a lot of cloud native companies, pretty much lots of state and local governments as well, and federal government. 85% of them have some form of AI technology in their cloud environment. So, if you're thinking about it from that standpoint, some sort of AI, whether it be a connection through an API to an outside environment, to a software, or some sort of large language model that someone's just toying around with perhaps, it's here already, and that adds more complexity to your environment. There's unique aspects of AI that are more difficult to defend, and then also I think people have to recognize it's going to change the game from an offensive and defensive standpoint as well. Just maybe not in the ways that people are thinking, but it's at very least in the near term going to up a lot of people's game who might not have been as effective before.
Yeah, very good point that you can't not use these tools to defend when you know that the folks attacking are absolutely using the most modern and effective tools. I want to pivot now and talk a little bit about the acquisition, because this was in the news, 10 days, 2 weeks ago? This is very fresh.
It feels like 3 months ago
feels
to me.
Feels like a long time,
yes,
I'm sure, but
it's been
very new. And speaking of new, Wiz is very new. It's only a 4-year-old company. So a 4-year-old company sold for $32 billion. Why did Google make this decision? I'm not saying you have to speak for the leaders of Google, but why do you think people are making decisions like this? Why right now, and why Wiz instead of any other cybersecurity company that's out there?
Sure. So I think one of the things that I will say is, we just had our 5th birthday as a company, and frankly,
happy birthday.
Thank you. I think we found a problem set, and we're able to create a solution for it that created really a new market in cybersecurity that was needed around cloud security. The reality is that everyone is facing a multi-cloud environment. No one is just in Azure or Google Cloud or OCI or whatever you may be in. You are using multiple different cloud environments. We did a public sector survey. We found that I think a quarter were using more than a dozen cloud environments.
Wow.
And I think 75% were using up to,
the big 3, perhaps?
Yeah, somewhere between 1 and 20. 1 in 11, sorry. So, there's a huge amount of diversity, and that's because you have complex environments, you're spinning up different things, and they're going to be available in different sort of cloud environments. That's just the reality that we live in. You may have most of your stuff in one agency, and it might be connected to another agency who's using a different platform or a different service or an outside vendor. I think people start to fear that complexity, and we provide a means of dealing with that complexity in a manner that democratizes it across your organization. When we look at cloud and AI, you're just seeing the speed and value of delivery, and this goes to kind of both on the development side and in the how we manage this. I think there's been a fear of cloud for a long time, but I think that fear doesn't come from its just existence. It's how do I manage this thing that I'm not used to managing with the organization I have in place. Our founders really looked at the problem and said, well, the problem is we keep building tools for the organizational structure we have, rather than thinking if this was something that we brought new, how would we organize around defending it? And so, one, we try and move away from things like putting agents out on one particular thing. 2, we'd recognize that identity is often the boundary, or almost always the boundary, and it gives you access to many different things in the cloud. And then 3, we'd allow it so that no matter where you are in the organization, you'd be able to understand, prioritize what is most concerning. And that's probably not going to be just, I have a vulnerability. Because you might have a 9.8 vulnerability somewhere, a very high-risk vulnerability, but it might be tucked far away. And maybe what the real risk is there's a misconfiguration on the edge of your network. In fact, that's usually the issue that leads to a privileged identity and some very sensitive information, or some sort of technology that is risky for the organization. So them recognizing that, understanding this risk right now, that understanding was spread across organizations. So how do you bring that together in one system that allows everyone to have the same visibility? And I think creating that common visibility and maintaining it across multiple clouds is something that clearly is of value to folks. It's responsible for our rapid growth and created really an industry around it. And I think Google saw that the reality is a multi-cloud future, and having this as part of their portfolio of things that they can do both strengthens their cloud environment and allows them to help fuel what we're doing really as well.
So Wiz will continue to work with other cloud environments, not just Google.
100%. Yeah, we are both committed to a multi-cloud platform that services all the different clouds.
And so then thinking about the different types of customers that you work with, different types of entities, public sector and private sector, how do they differ? How do public sector entities have different needs than private? How do public sector entities have different needs than private sector, and vice versa? And how does that then change the way you do your engagements as a company with these different types of
yeah,
partners?
I think number one, our private sector, on the private sector, things are much more revenue driven. Obviously there are revenue considerations on the public sector side, but you also have to realize your customers, if you're on the public sector side, are very diverse and have different needs, and you can't decide that you don't need these customers anymore. They are your residents, they are your citizens, they are people who are visiting.
Everybody.
You have to serve everybody, right?
Also risk aversion. I would guess that risk aversion is probably something that's front and center in the public sector, even
Correct.
more so than in the private sector.
Correct, and there tends to be also just rules and policies and compliance regimes that may or may not fit a new technology the right way, and getting to the point where you can do both sometimes takes time. So cloud has taken more time. Sometimes, in some places, you can only spend on cloud in certain ways. You can only spend on it with capital or working funds rather than capital. There's all sorts of hiccups, I guess, in the public sector that you can bulldoze through a little quicker on the private sector side. But here's what I would say. I think there is concern about data privacy that has traditionally, and we have a recent survey on this, 49% of respondents said their real hesitation with the cloud was around data privacy and security. I think understanding how to tackle that problem well will help with the many cloud migrations that are going on across the country with cities and states and so on, just because it allows for more speed, more flexibility, but it also does add a better layer of security than the server in the corner. The reality is cloud is more, you can standardize it more, you can do things that allow you to defend better. It's just our management structures for it and our historical way of managing it has created a lot of fear.
I remember back in 2012 when I was in the White House, we were having these conversations about, is the cloud secure? How do we actually have confidence in it? And it's kind of amazing that some of those conversations actually still need to be had today. I'm curious, for the folks here, who here works in government? Who here works in public sector? Okay, excellent. So maybe about a third of the people listening right now. Let's move specifically to smart cities. When you think about some of the things, for example, that Etienne was talking about in his keynote fireside, the way they rapidly deployed a lot of tools to host major events. That's going to be happening with the FIFA World Cup next year here in the US, in LA in 2028. What advice would you have for the folks, whether it's the people in the government side or the private sector partners, as they're doing that kind of work? What advice would you have to make sure that these events they run are as secure as they should be?
So I think, when you're talking about managing change, I guess, and this is really about managing change in a lot of ways, because there's going to be a lot of requests to do big things when you have big events and things like that. I would say as you shift over, try and think about how do we do this for the new environment. So when I was at OMB working for the federal CIO and federal CISO, we implemented a zero trust strategy, and it was about changing our approach to securing government IT enterprise resources. And essentially, we kind of came up with about a dozen steps that we thought were foundational to building zero trust in a federal environment. What we ran into, and much of this would translate very easily. It's not rocket science. A lot of it was multi-factor authentication, encryption, endpoint detection response, some of the basic building blocks of zero trust. What we found is that, for 70, 80% of federal systems that seemed to work. The places where we started running into issues was it didn't quite fit for IoT and OT, right? And then it didn't also quite fit for cloud. And the reality is, there are certain technologies that need to be managed differently. And I think recognizing early on what fits within your models and use cases, and then understanding that there's these other things, and unfortunately, often the response in government is like, well, we'll just make an exception for that. But trying to figure out how you can manage those exceptions well, and recognize that often those are the emerging areas that you're just going to have to do more of, whether it be AI, whether it be IoT, whether it be cloud in general. If you don't get your hands around it pretty quickly, it's going to become a lot of exceptions and a lot of risk.
And I think the point you brought up earlier about during a pandemic, for example, when people need something to go live, suddenly there's a desire to get a lot of those exemptions. Better to have the tools in place ahead of time so you don't have to do that.
100%.
So tell us about what's a threat vector that you feel like people are underestimating right now?
Oof. I would say there is the non-human identity issue, I think, is one that I would say. Everybody is plugging in a lot of different things into their environment. It might be a software as a service.
AI agents, does that just get
AI
even bigger and
agents
bigger?
is a good one. I think there's also, we have a lot of software as a service plugged in, all of those sort of things, and supply chain attacks have become more and more interesting to attackers. So you've gone off after large organizations through, whether it be going into GitHub and changing a little bit of code here and there, or going after large entities like a software as a service provider, or like there's been a couple attacks on the federal government that way. What I would say is you have to understand that risk and appropriately secure around it. And that doesn't mean, I think there's an over-reliance on documentation around that, which I think is important. You want to make sure you're doing the right things when you purchase and procure a tool. But I think monitoring those non-human identities, those things that you're hooking into your environment, those and understanding how they are interacting with your environment in constant real time is important, because the reality is you never know when one of your providers might get owned by a hacker, and they could be very good at what they do, and they could do all the right things, and a hacker could get right one time. So I think that as we get these more complex environments, as we have more shared services, is probably one of the more concerning things that we see more and more of.
Mitch, I want to wrap things up because we're almost at time, but I've got a question that I think is going to be relevant to a lot of people here. When you think of cities, they are generally led by a mayor or a city manager. And if you could give those people one piece of advice for what they should do on the cybersecurity front, what would it be? Other than buy Wiz, that you can't say that. But anything else, other than just hire Wiz, something else.
No. And beyond hiring Wiz, I would say, look, I think have some strong partners in the private sector and the public sector you trust on these issues, and have regular meetings with them, because the environment is constantly changing. Cybersecurity on the private sector side as well is a churn. So if you're never going to buy that last tool or that shiny object that's going to
no silver bullet.
We're all done. That is not going to happen. The threats continue to change, and the environments and technology continue to change. So, trying to stay smart on it is important, but having some people you can trust to tell you what is changing and what those new dynamics and those creative, whether it's creative defense or creative offense coming against you looks like, and what you need to be prepared for as you adopt new technologies and try and do service delivery better, and also be more efficient. Like having those conversations and not just limiting it to your public sector partners, but your private sector partners also, because unfortunately, as I know, like the public sector tends to get pitched the kind of tools that they've used in the past from the same vendors over and over. I think having new people come in and talk to new people about it outside of those who often come to the public sector is a good thing.
Good advice. Thank you. Mitch Herckis from Wiz. Thanks for being with us at Smart City Expo USA.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
And thank you so much, John Paul and Mitch.